It's not a coincidence. We have to look for a new world order. There has to be a world order where law, respect of humans, respect of nations, respect of peoples, and cooperation will have to prevail. Peace will have to be there. They can't continue dominating from slavery to colonialism to neocolonialism to hegemony. How long can people sustain this dangerous ideology destabilizing every part of the world? So I say the Eritrea-Russia or Russia-Africa relationship is not a coincidence. It's a reality that makes this a mission. It's a mission for humanity. Humanity will have to fight for creating a world order that takes everybody out of this jungle. This is a jungle where you have this minority of minorities making life very difficult for everybody. So I say this is not a coincidence. It's not even an option for us to come and work together in solidarity. It's a mission. It's a mission for humanity. It will be inclusive of everybody, Russia, Africa, but also Latin America, Asia. People in Europe and America are also suffering from this dangerous ideology that we have witnessed the last 30 years.
Welcome back to Drawer for Africa, the channel where we uncover the untold truths and fight for the liberation and dignity of our continent. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, because on this channel, we expose the lies, hypocrisy, and hidden agendas threatening Africa's sovereignty every single day. Today, we're diving into a topic that's not just about Eritrea, it's about the future of Africa and the global fight for justice. For centuries, Africa has been the playground of imperial powers, from slavery to colonialism to neocolonialism, and now a new wave of domination disguised as freedom and democracy. But how long can this dangerous ideology of control and destabilization continue? Eritrea, a small nation in the Horn of Africa, has become the latest target. Why? Because it refuses to bow. It stands as a symbol of resistance to Western imperialism, rejecting outside interference, and calling for African solutions to African problems. But now, calls for regime change are growing louder, led by the same forces that destroyed Iraq, Libya, and so many others. The question is, will we let them turn Eritrea into the next victim of their destructive agenda? This is not just about Eritrea. This is about the survival of African sovereignty, the independence of nations everywhere, and the fight for a new world order where respect for humanity and cooperation prevail over domination and exploitation. So, stay tuned, because we're about to expose the hypocrisy, the lies, and the real motives behind the push for regime change in Eritrea. This is a battle for Africa and for the soul of humanity. Let's get into it.
A lot of people wondering what he's going to do from a foreign policy perspective. You know, Africa is kind of a black hole in terms of what Trump may do. And, you know, I think some people consider that to be good. Like, they think Trump won't really do that much there. But you can see that many of the worst actors on African issues are now lobbying the Trump administration to take certain actions. And you know, we've done a lot on this show to cover Eritrea. We traveled there together. I've traveled there several times myself. We've reported on it. So I just want to note, even though, you know, it's a small country in Africa, people don't think a lot about it. But a guy named Michael Rubin, who's sort of a high up kind of guy in the think tank diplomatic government world, now he works at the American Enterprise Institute, published an article, I think about a week and a half ago, calling on the Trump administration to carry out regime change in Eritrea, saying now is the time. And anyone who follows Eritrea, you know, or honestly any country where there's regime change, same basic story. It's evil, it's a dictatorship, there's all these bad things, and now is the great opportunity for America to bring freedom and democracy to Eritrea. Eritrea. So this is actually a long-running issue. Eritrea is under sanctions. It's been under sanctions. There's consistent sort of calls from people like Michael Rubin, but in a context where, you may have a kind of tabula rasa type situation in the Trump administration, I think it can be particularly dangerous because these things can kind of sneak in, if you will, if there's not necessarily awareness of what's going on. And I want to raise it for a couple of reasons that I think are very important for people to recognize why this is a bad idea. I mean, first and foremost, we're talking about Eritrea, which is in the Horn of Africa, which is already one of the parts of the world that is the most war-torn. I mean, Sudan, which we talked about earlier on this show, Ethiopia, which has numerous running conflicts, Somalia, which has numerous running conflicts, an area of the world where people have been intensely suffering due to many different wars, interventions, sanctions, most of which have their roots, by the way, in sort of imperial policy to shape and control the Horn of Africa because it's so geostrategically important. It sits right there in the Suez Canal, on the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Indian Ocean. And so going well back into the 1800s, this has been one of the main areas for imperialists to try to control, and it often destabilized. So Eritrea is essentially the only country in the region that has any stability whatsoever. I mean, it's very stable, actually. It's the only stable country that's not really being racked by a war right now, a civil war, a really bad one in many different cases. And undoubtedly, any attempt at regime change in Eritrea would destabilize that country because this is a country that, like many countries that are targeted for regime change, whatever critiques people have, there are many people who support the current government and undoubtedly would stand up and push back against regime change, which means the country would be torn apart. So a region that is already suffering, unimaginable horrors from destabilization, sanctions, different regime change efforts that have existed would be sunk even deeper into the mire, and the people of Eritrea and the surrounding countries could only suffer any more. So in the same way we look at Iraq, in the same way we look at Libya, in the same way we look at all of these different countries, this effort in general, just beyond anything else, to try to ask for and push for regime change in Eritrea by elements that are, in the Republican Party, so they feel like they can influence Trump, is very, very dangerous for African people in the Horn of Africa. And then one other thing I want to just note about this, or two other things quickly. One is the rationale for this. And as you know, Rania, very well, there's always this intense targeting. But when you really look at Eritrea and compare it to other countries in Africa, and I think that's the most important thing from a contextual point of view, and you look at also the countries that are U.S. allies, you really start to ask some questions about why this is a country that's being targeted. I mean, for instance, Kenya, one of the number one allies of the United States. Ruto was here. They're a major non-NATO ally now. They're getting weapons. They're getting money. They're sort of fronting the U.S. occupation in Haiti, all of these different things. Well, Eritrea has a higher life expectancy than Kenya. And life expectancy, of course, is heavily associated with access to public health resources, many different other things. But it's a number one indicator, or one of the main indicators of overall quality of life and certainly of income inequality. So Eritrea, higher life expectancy than Kenya. You don't hear Michael Rubin or any of these other people saying, let's have regime change in Kenya. In fact, they're talking about getting closer with Kenya. Eritrea has a child mortality rate that is lower, or better, you should say, than Uganda. Also close U.S. ally. A little bit more on the rocks, but you don't hear anyone saying, let's overthrow Uganda. It has a higher literacy rate than Zambia or Rwanda. So that means that they're teaching more people to read than those two countries, which are two of the closest allies to the United States. Zambia now is becoming a base. They're moving U.S. military people there. They even have the Venezuelan opposition trying to set up a school for regime change around the world in Zambia. Rwanda, of course, everyone knows. And quite frankly, not that I'm any big fan of the liberal Western style democracy, but if you're going to be writing articles talking about Eritrea doesn't have democracy, I don't know how you can then say Rwanda is a good friend. So again, you have countries like Kenya, Zambia, Rwanda, very close. Namibia, and this is no shade on Namibia, no shade on them at all, but just to note, they got their independence at roughly the same time as Eritrea. In Eritrea, 80% of people live within 2 hours of walking of a healthcare facility, 76% in Namibia. So obviously, that's a sign. Namibia has not been under sanctions, in many ways, more favorable economic environment. And again, that's not to shade them whatsoever. It's a very difficult situation for all African countries. But again, Eritrea doing better. So that's what you don't hear. You don't hear that they have a higher life expectancy than Kenya, higher literacy than Zambia and Rwanda, that they actually have a better access to healthcare than a country like Namibia, that they're above the sub-Saharan African average in terms of rural access to electricity. You don't hear any of those things. So why is it that now people are saying, let's have regime change in Eritrea? Well, I think you can answer that question very easily. Eritrea does not sign up to the broader U.S. agenda in the region and around the world. I mean, they were sanctioned for standing up against the balkanization of Somalia in the early 2000s. They were sanctioned by the United Nations basically for saying that Somalia should not be broken apart, destroyed, and thrown into civil war. When there was a regime change operation in Ethiopia to reinstall the TPLF, which was the U.S. proxy in the region, Eritrea stepped up and they opposed that as well. In the context of what we've even been seeing happen in Palestine. I mean, they have been outspoken at all international forums on that issue and always voted in favor of all the UN resolutions around Palestine and Gaza and things that have been going forward. It's a country that fiercely values its independence and that consistently argues that the future of the Horn of Africa should be for the people of the Horn of Africa, the future of Africa should be for the people of Africa, and that these outside imperial actors, should not be able to determine things. Now, it doesn't mean they don't say they want relations with anyone who's open to have relations, but that other countries shouldn't be dictating to Africa the way they have for 500 years. And of course, that is the worst possible thing. And every country that says that is aggressively targeted. We've seen it in Zimbabwe. We're seeing it now in the Sahel. And that's what's really happening, in Eritrea. And I think it's important for people to look at, and this is where I'll close, Rania, because the other big push that's happening from a lot of folks in the sort of right-wing sphere who follow Africa is to push the Trump administration to recognize Somaliland, which is a region of Somalia that is sort of trying to set itself up as an independent country. And just so you know, Rania, the thing that Somaliland officials are now saying about why the U.S. should recognize them is because they'll put a U.S. military base in Somaliland, and that will allow the U.S. to have greater control over the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, over the Red Sea, to be able to have a base to attack Yemen, and that the U.S. base should move from Djibouti to Somaliland because you can't trust Djibouti because they also got a Chinese base there. So Somaliland, which also is one of the few countries that still recognizes Taiwan as the ruler of all China, yep, that's right, they do, is saying, yes, please set up a military base here. We'll be so pro-U.S. and so pro-UK, and they've got a big lobby of people in the U.S. and the UK, but that undoubtedly will only deepen the conflict in Somalia. Somali people in many other parts of the country are fiercely opposed to this dismemberment. So you've got this push coming from people to say, let's do regime change in Eritrea, let's recognize Somaliland in the Trump administration, and all of it is of one piece, to try to make sure that the broader Horn of Africa, Red Sea, Nile Basin area, it remains within the control of imperial dictates, that any country that is standing up to that is weakened, and that the area is balkanized and racked in war, which they're not that concerned about. They're happy for these places to be racked in war because ultimately, to the extent they start to come together, it can really shift the balance of power on a world scale. The same thing in many other parts of the region. You see that divide and conquer is the way they want to rule. So, Eritrea is a small country that not a lot of people hear about, but I think, it's important to note some of these things, because if it's not brought out into the light of the day, that's how these policies, can sort of sneak up, and it will be devastating for the entire region of the Horn of Africa for these types of moves like a regime change push. And I think anyone who cares about, not having more wars and more destruction in Africa, really should raise their voice on this. And I just hope that you check out some of what we've done about Eritrea here at Breakthrough News. I know for some people, they don't like what we have to say, but I think ultimately it's an important perspective to understand African countries, development in African nations, and what possibly can come and what we will hopefully see come for Africa here in the rest of this century, which is real self-determination and liberation. So sorry for that monologue there, but
really, No, I think it's really important. I think people need to take very seriously this neoconservative attitude about the world, which really at this point exists in both parties. But the neocons, they always make a comeback, and they have this good and evil view of the world that doesn't actually have any basis in reality in terms of, because there's no such thing as good and evil. That's just a very black and white view of the world, but it's a very convenient view of the world that literally just